Thank you so much for being out here. It really means a lot to us that you come to these events that we get to host as the Center for Presidential History to support us, to support ongoing work in history, and to support the guests that we invite to come from all over the world. It's just part of what we get to do at CPH. I know there are always new faces in the crowd, and I just want to tell you just a little bit about what we get to do. First of all, we get to sponsor, support research in American presidential history, really broadly speaking. A lot of that happens especially through our postdoctoral fellows who come from really all over the world to work with us for a couple of years after they've finished their PhDs. Right now, we've got postdoctoral fellows who did their PhDs at Penn State, Yale, George Mason, Oxford, and against all of my Aggie instincts, UT Austin. We had 2 at a time, can you believe it? And they work on all sorts of topics in American presidential history, diplomatic relations with other countries, international religious freedom, the office of the First Lady, on totally irrelevant topics like presidential pardoning power, things like that. So that's one aspect of what we get to do. We do a lot of work on what we call our Collective Memory Project. It's an oral history project where we sit down with a camera with someone who worked most of the time in the realm of the George W. Bush presidency, and we sit down for about an hour and a half and have a conversation with them about what their work was, why they did what they did, why they made the decisions they made. And all of that is transcribed and put up online for anyone to be able to go and learn and research, and we hope will be valuable sources going forward. And then the last thing we do is what we're doing here tonight. We do a lot of public outreach, public events, where we invite in scholars from all over to come and share some of their most recent, some of their most exciting work. For tonight, I want to thank especially the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute and the Scott Hawkins Fund who helped fund our ability to do this tonight. And I also want to thank my colleague Lai Leong, especially, who did a ton of work in making sure it's all gone off very swimmingly. So thank you to those colleagues. Tonight, you are here with me to welcome Dr. Monica Kim. Dr. Kim is Associate Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin. Her full title there, by the way, I want to read this, is the William Appleman Williams and David G. and Marion S. Meissner Chair in U.S. International and Diplomatic History. I think that's what she tells her students to call her every time they ask a question. Embedded in that is a lot of what you may not be aware of, amazing American history and historiography, because the University of Wisconsin has been pretty widely known for a long time to be kind of a bedrock institution for the study of American foreign policy. One of the names of her chair, William Appleman Williams, is one of the great writers of American foreign policy history, so it's a pretty great title that she has there, where she researches and writes about U.S. foreign policy, 20th century decolonization, transnational political movements, and much more. She won't tell you this, I'm sure of it, but I will. She was a 2022 MacArthur Fellow, what we colloquially known as the MacArthur Genius Award. I assume there's at least one genius among us tonight, probably more than one. She's here to talk about her book, The Interrogation Rooms of the Korean War, The Untold History. You might have seen it outside. There's several for sale. We hope you'll take advantage of that. When it came out, it won many awards, essentially best book type awards or best first book awards. Some of those came from the Association for Asian American Studies, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, which is the flagship organization for writing American foreign policy, and the Society for Military History, which is the flagship organization for the study of military history. So these awards are a pretty big deal. And so we're just really lucky tonight and grateful to have Dr. Kim with us as she tells us about her great book. So join me in welcoming Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Brian. That was a really generous introduction, and I think very much in line with what I've heard about the center and all of you tonight, which is that I was going to be speaking with a community and sharing my work with a community. So thank you all for showing up, and thank you for sharing your evening with me as I get to tell you a little bit about my most recent book. I want to thank, even though Jeff is not here right now, he's over across the Atlantic, but I do want to thank Jeff Engels for the initial invite here, Brian Franklin for following up on that, and Lai Liang, where's Lai? Oh, for masterminding all of the events of today. And of course, where is Rana? Is Rana here? Rana Spitz, I'm sure you hear everybody always praising her and just thanking her for helming the ship to get me here. Okay, so, even before I begin, number one, I heard that there might be some K through 12 educators in the audience. That's great, welcome. I actually was a middle school teacher before going to grad school, so it really means a lot to know that we've got some K through 12 educators in the audience who are doing such important work. I wanted to kind of share two things before I launch into talking about my book, and kind of comes from my work as a middle school teacher. I was really interested in telling a story about the Korean War from what we call the bottom up. Interestingly, in the history books about the Korean War, it's very usually top down, which means like presidents, generals, et cetera, et cetera. I really wanted to get at ordinary people, and that I really believe that Truman also very much figures in this book, but I also thought that the ordinary Korean peasant, the ordinary American soldier, they also have an understanding about global geopolitics, and they also are trying to navigate it just as much as President Truman was doing. So that's one thing I wanted to share. The second thing before I launch into talking about the book is just so that we're all aware of this, the Korean War actually has not officially yet come to an end. The only thing that is holding that peace on that peninsula right now is a ceasefire that was signed in 1953. And in fact, that ceasefire has everything to do with the POWs who I'll be talking about today. But I'm mentioning that because that was also another real puzzle for me as I was writing this book. So not only did I want to do kind of a bottom-up story of the Korean War, but I also, how does one write a history of a war that still hasn't ended, right? And how do I write it in a way that actually points to how it still has not ended? And the answer for that, at least for me, was to begin in the interrogation room. So I would like to begin today with a story about a mutiny. Or at least mutiny is what the United States military would call this event in retrospect, after news of the event exploded across newspaper headlines across the globe. Now, the so-called mutiny didn't happen on what we think of as the usual battlefields on the Korean Peninsula. Instead, we have to go to the United Nations Camp Number 1 on Koche Island, located over here. And UNC Camp Number 1 was the largest prisoner of war camp under the command of US and United Nations military forces. And on May 7th, 1952, 6 Korean POWs kidnapped Brigadier General Francis Dodd, the US Army commander of this very POW camp. So, this is what happened. In the early afternoon, Brigadier General Dodd walked over to Compound 76, where he met with, sorry, I did exactly what you thought I was going to do, which is that, all right, here we go. Whoops. There we go. All right. Brian warned me. He's like, you're going to point it at the screen. I'm like, no, I teach, and I'll remember. But yeah, of course that happens. All right. So in the afternoon of May 7th, Brigadier General Dodd walks over to Compound 76, where he's going to be meeting with 6 Korean POWs who had been requesting to meet with him for a while. They talk through the barbed wire fence main gate of the compound. At one point, one of the POWs, Sung Moo-jun, right here, a large man of considerable strength. He walked slowly through the fence when the fence opened to let a truck carrying tents through. He stretches his arms, pretends to yawn, and then he grabs Dodd. The POWs literally carried Dodd into the compound, closing the barbed wire fence behind him. The whole affair lasts only a few minutes. After the POWs carried Dodd into the compound, they unfurled a large sign over the main compound building. "We have captured Dodd," stated the sign in English. "He will not be harmed if POW problems are resolved. If you shoot, his life will be in danger." So this POW camp on the island of Koje, with a population of over 170,000 POWs, seemed to be on the periphery of the war's main events. But the POW's kidnapping of Dodd catapulted this POW camp into the global limelight. Rumors of the POW's capture of Dodd sent the US press into a frenzy. The front page of the LA Times on May 9th, 1952 blared, "8th Army ordered to free general held by red POWs." US editorial desks and journalists portrayed the kidnapping as something unbelievable and beyond the realm of the rational. Sensational, bizarre, incredible, fantastic were some of the words used. But one particular striking detail reported about the kidnapping seemed to puzzle the journalists even more. It involved a rather unusual request, and this is a quote from the New York Times. Quote, "It was disclosed that the communists had asked for 1,000 sheets of paper, presumably writing paper, and that this already had been sent to the island. The purpose was not clear, but the requisite order was issued." Unquote. No one in the US military, government, or media seemed to be able to comprehend why the Korean POWs had kidnapped the camp commander, let alone why they had asked for so much paper. When Brigadier General Dodd emerged from Compound 76 3 days later, the US Army sent in paratroopers, tanks, concussion grenades, and tear gas, resulting in the deaths of 34 POWs and 1 US soldier. The spectacular mass violence on the part of the US military in reaction to the Korean POWs' actions, including the supposedly mysterious request for 1,000 sheets of paper, begs the question of, well, why such anxiety on the part of the US military? What was the threat? The Korean Communist POWs, or more specifically the quote, Oriental Communist POW, according to the US military, was supposedly not acting like a prisoner of war. In fact, in a US military study conducted during the war titled, quote, "The Oriental Communist Prisoner of War, a study from the intelligence viewpoint," the writer would conclude, the US Army has never had to deal with this type of prisoner before. So, in other words, the Korean prisoners of war, according to the US military, were challenging what I would like to call the formal script of warfare. Indeed, the Dodd kidnapping laid bare a seeming political conundrum that was unfolding on the post-1945 global stage. As Western powers refined and redefined the laws of war in the aftermath of the devastation from World War II in an attempt to define and regulate warfare, the official outbreak of the Korean War on June 25th, 1950 revealed an undeniably curious situation. It appeared that states were no longer officially waging war anymore. And indeed, after 1945, states no longer and have not officially declared war. So, when the press asked President Harry Truman if the US was at war on the Korean Peninsula, Truman replied, "We are not at war." And he agreed that the US military was instead involved in what he called a police action. So, war, we must remember, was a privilege accorded to only recognized states. only sovereign entities could engage in what Clausewitz has famously conceptualized as a dual, a legitimate extension of policymaking involving two recognizable states. And nowhere was the issue of political recognition laid more bare than at the negotiation tables for the armistice at the village of Panmunjom. I've done it again. There we go. There we go. Thank you for the support. So at the village of Panmunjom, which is where the armistice negotiations were going on, something kind of a little unusual or a little bit strange is happening. So the United Nations, which is clearly not a nation state, had entered the conflict as an official belligerent, or participating in the role that the UN would not take up again until the first Gulf War. Also, as for China and North Korea, who were also at the negotiation tables, the UN did not recognize either state as sovereign entities. So my argument in this book is that at the negotiating tables at Panmunjom, to define what was legitimate warfare was to define who was a legitimate state in this situation. Now, the POWs who had kidnapped General Dodd understood this fully. At the US Army's press conference on the Dodd kidnapping, the US Army official described the situation as such, and this is quite remarkable. Quote, "The communists are talking with General Dodd. It is a one-day Panmunjom." Or he's saying that it's basically like the armistice meetings, only it's happening in a compound on the POW camp. So the POW camp on Koje Island was indeed not on the periphery of the events of the war, but already in the center of the struggle over the stakes of what I call sovereign recognition in the war. So the POWs who had captured Dodd quickly entered the global media spotlight because the figure of the POW was already the most contested topic at this armistice negotiations at Panmunjom. So what happens is that on January 1952, basically all of the terms of the armistice are essentially settled. But on January 1952, the US representative for the United Nations Command puts a new proposal on the table. And it's a new proposal for what he called voluntary repatriation. And according to this proposal, the Korean and Chinese POWs under UNC custody would be free to choose whether or not they wanted to return to their homeland. The US military interrogation room, as both the US delegate and the Truman administration insisted, would be a space of what they called free will. The delegates of North Korea and China quickly pointed to the fact that the 1949 Geneva Conventions on the treatment of POWs called for mandatory repatriation. So as I was doing research, it was kind of stunning because at this point in my research, I realized that every state and every organization was in this moment claiming to have the interrogation room that best exemplified democratic or liberatory ideals. This is quite a, quite a statement. The POW controversy of the Korean War touched off a constellation of political anxieties and ambitions because it resonated with a very basic problematic confronting the post-1945 decolonizing world. So which state in the post-1945 decolonizing world could reinvent the most intimate relations of the colonizer and the colonized, represented by the interrogator and the POW, into one of liberation, democracy, or empire? So in this book, I tell this global history of the Korean War through 4 different military interrogation rooms, those created by the US military, South Korean paramilitary youth groups, the North Korean and Chinese militaries, and the Indian custodian force. The book opens with Japanese-American internment and the US occupation of Korea. I then follow 4,000 Japanese Americans to Korea, where they served as interrogators during the Korean War. I then traced the post-war journeys of Korean POWs shipped by the United Nations and Indian military to India, Brazil, and Argentina. And I finally map out the movements of American POWs through the interrogation networks within Chinese and North Korean POW camps. Okay, let's begin with how the figure of the POW becomes the central issue on the armistice negotiation table, right? So why does the US decide to put on this new proposal, and why, what is at stake actually for the United States in suggesting and really pushing for this proposal? So we have to remember, so in August 1951, so before January of 1952, the Truman administration has created a new committee that is part of the White House, and it is called the Psychological Strategy Board, or the PSB. Now, the Psychological Strategy Board has a mandate to basically figure out what is in the US's interest in terms of the Cold War. And interestingly, the PSB hones in on the Korean POW as a possible site on which to configure the Cold War aims of the Truman administration. So it was already a kind of difficult task for Truman to mobilize kind of mass support behind what he called a police action, right? It's a lot easier to kind of imagine a war. But even then, it was hard to imagine who exactly is an enemy in a police action, all right? Also, by the time we are in mid-1951, Truman's initial reason for getting the US involved on the Korean peninsula was that North Korea had transgressed and crossed over the 38th parallel, okay? By mid-1951, Truman had already given the green light to General MacArthur to then cross northwards over the 38th parallel, right? So he no longer even has the 38th parallel as a good reason for the US involvement in the war. So the PSB decides that if you can't make an enemy for this war, they're going to make someone that they need to rescue, that the US needs to rescue, and that becomes the POW. So through this POW controversy, we can see the development of a hallmark of latter 20th century US wars of intervention, where the individual person, here the POW, becomes both the terrain for warfare and also its reason for entering war, the jus ad bellum. For example, from the latter half of the 20th century, we see that the US putatively does not go to war for its own state interests, right? Every time the US enters a kind of war of intervention, they're saying they're entering it on behalf of individuals elsewhere. So we see this start up in the Korean War. All right, so how did the US frame what was at stake in the interrogation rooms? From the outset, the US emphasized individual choice as the key element at stake in the debate over POW repatriation. And the US interrogation room became exemplary of what they called liberal democratic governance. The US delegate to the Panmunjom negotiations, Admiral Libby, recast voluntary repatriation as freedom of choice and mandatory repatriation as forced repatriation. And he went even so far as to say that, quote, the United Nations command proposal is a Bill of Rights for individuals. So here, according to the US, the act of saying yes or no in the repatriation screening room was framed as a moment of liberal individual choice. Now, what was at stake for the US in this choice for Korean POWs? So now we have to go back to 1945 on the eve of the Japanese unconditional surrender. The US proposes that the division, that the Korean peninsula and the colony of Korea be divided at the 38th parallel. This is accepted by Stalin and the Soviets, and so we have Below the 30th parallel, the US military occupation of the South. Above the 30th parallel, you have the Soviet military occupation of the North. So if you have, during the Korean War, POWs who supposedly come down from the North to choose to go to the South, that really legitimates and validates the US project of supposed liberation of South Korea below the 38th parallel over the northern Soviet occupation of the peninsula. So, what's interesting is that in this kind of interrogation room that the US is presenting, this interrogation room is supposed to really derive its own authority on the ability of the interrogator to know what the POW wants and what the POW desires, right? It's supposed to be an easy yes or no, north or south. But it's a lot more complicated than that for the Korean POWs who are on this island of Kodae. There's over 170,000 POWs. So who are they? Among the 170,000 POWs in the camp were 50,000 POWs who claimed to be from the South originally. People had been drafted or had joined a North Korean People's Army, and when it had come through the South early in the war. And after the Chinese Volunteer Army entered the war, the US military began rounding up entire villages and taking all of them as POWs. So, for example, what you would have in the POW camp sometimes were 3 generations of a family, a grandfather, a father, and a son. Also, what I was just mentioning earlier about, about the South Koreans who were then taken as POWs. So you actually had South Korean soldiers, okay, South Korean army soldiers who surrendered as POWs to North Korean soldiers, okay? And then when those North Korean soldiers surrendered to US or United Nations troops, the US soldiers decided that they couldn't differentiate between the South Korean and the North Korean, so they just put them all into the POW camp. So it was getting a little complicated, see, right? Also, at this point in 1951, no one thought that 38th parallel was going to become permanent, right? And you have families that are divided across that parallel. So this idea of where is home, right? Where is your family, where you want to go, is not as simple as simply a yes or no, or north or south. And so in a way, these POWs are a real testament to how artificial that 38th parallel was as an accepted state border on the ground. Okay, let me now move to the interrogation room. So these are some photos that are clear. Well, these are POWs very young. Yes, you can see how young these young boys are. This is a photo of the Kodae compound, and also this is a young woman who, and clearly, again, this is stage. Okay, what I'm going to share with you now is a lecture that I found in the National Archives, and it had been mimeographed actually quite a few times. So it was clearly a very important lecture on what was called, let's see, let me just make sure that I have the correct. So the title of the lecture is Some Aspects of Interrogation of Oriental POWs. And this lecture was given by a Lieutenant Commander, Samuel C. Bartlett, Jr., and he had actually been a translator at Iwo Jima, right? Now, his lecture essentially boils down the interrogation process to 5 simple steps. And the template that he gives for interrogating Oriental POWs, he calls it the process of procuring information from an Oriental prisoner of war. And here's a direct quote. "While the process is not always so simple," began Bartlett's notes, "it may be likened to a drink out of a coconut. First, may be likened to a drink out of a coconut. Cut the top off with a machete and pour it out. There are 6 steps even in this simple process. Number 1, get coconut. Number 2, make sure there is milk in it. You can see him shaking it, yes? Cut it open. Number 3. Number 4, remove milk. Number 5, taste milk for potability. Number 6, give it to the thirsty party." So this is the pamphlet and the lecture that was used for training interrogators during the Korean War. Now, we can see here that the primary central concern here was not so much about the POW, right? Not so much about the POW. What's actually the primary concern here is how good was the interrogator at controlling the interrogation, right? At demonstrating a superior intelligence that effectively rendered the Oriental as an object, here a coconut, as transparent as naive. The claim to know the desires of the Korean POW was also an assertion of US superior rationale, judgment, and the ability to govern. The simple yes or no that the Korean POW would supposedly give fit all too well within the logic of the naive Oriental, one with no history. However, this was only an ideal template. In practice, US military interrogation during the Korean War had a pretty serious obstacle, which was language. So because of Asian exclusion acts that were passed in the late 1800s, we didn't exactly have the largest Korean American community to draw upon to serve as interrogators. So the US military decided to draft and recruit Japanese Americans to serve as interrogators and translators for this war, because they simply assumed that Koreans would know Japanese and due to previous Japanese colonial rule of Korea. Approximately, and through my research, I discovered that approximately 4,000, and this is what my estimate, approximately 4,000 Japanese Americans were in the Korean War, serving in some linguistic capacity in the US military. And the vast majority of them, if we think about this, if they're like 18 years old all the way to 25, right? The vast majority of them had spent their own adolescence behind barbed wire, right? They were in the internment camps. So how did the US military reconcile the racial logics of Bartlett's template, the procuring the coconut milk, with the reality of the labor that was needed for interrogation? Well, they created a racialized hierarchy of labor. John Fuji, an AP Associated Press journalist, wrote an article describing an interrogation scene on the post-battle battlefield. In this scene, we can see Lieutenant Henry J. Picard, a white officer from Louisiana. He was the head of the interrogation team. This team consisted of 6 men total, including Picard, a Chinese civilian, a former Korean policeman who did the initial interrogation, a South Korean army lieutenant who had grown up in China and was educated in Japan, so he's conversant in Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean, and 2 Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. Picard's assistant was First Lieutenant Thomas Shiratsuki, a Nisei from Salinas, California. And we also have Private Kenjiro Fred Wakugawa, another Nisei of Honolulu. Now, I found this article in the National Archives. It never made it to press. And I believe that it never made it to press and was censored because this article really lays out kind of the, well, number one, it almost seems like Whisper Down the Lane, right, in multiple languages. And so it kind of it makes the resulting interrogation report, right, perhaps not quite as straightforward as one would assume. So I think that the labor that's involved here, right, is actually quite threatening for the US military to get out there into the public. Let me introduce you to Sam Miyamoto. Mr. Miyamoto has now, at this point, passed away, but I met him in 2007, and I was in California at a Japanese-American veterans reunion and interviewed about 12 different former interrogators. And Sam, I just want to tell you a little bit about what Sam Miyamoto had told me about his experiences in terms of interrogating Korean POWs. So Sam Miyamoto arrives at that UNC Camp Number 1, and one of his instructions were to persuade POWs to not choose repatriation to the Northern Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And in his repatriation screening interrogation room, he did not have a white US military intelligence officer presiding, which I think is really interesting because there usually was, okay? So it appeared that Miyamoto himself was to persuade the Korean POW to not repatriate by embodying the Asian who had successfully assimilated, right, into the United States. His supposed desire and consent to participate in the US military project was supposed to be the kind of guidance for the Korean POW in their decision. But it's a remarkable, there's many remarkable stories that I got from Sam Miyamoto. And he's 20 years old when he arrives on Koje Island. And he told me that almost without fail, in the other US military interrogation rooms, the Korean communist POW would always spit on the ground before they entered the US military interrogation room, clearly as a way to say, we don't recognize your authority, right? But when they got to his interrogation room, instead of spitting, they wanted to ask him a question. And they wanted to ask him why he was working with the US Army when, as a Japanese American, the US Army and the US government had imprisoned him behind barbed wire. Now, Miyamoto described his reply to the POW as follows. I told him the truth. I said, I'm here because I was ordered to come here, and it's true, he was drafted. I didn't come here by choice. I was ordered to join the army, and I was ordered to study the Korean language, and I was ordered to come here and talk to you about this. So, in between a reluctant interrogator and a defiant POW, a very different interrogation emerges. In effect, the Korean POW and the Japanese-American interrogator were essentially saying that they reject, right, the US assertion that Japanese Americans had now successfully assimilated and they accept what had happened in the recent past. And also the Korean Oriental POW was refusing to say that the US had successfully decolonized them also. So, now I'm going to turn back to Compound 76 and to that strange, most important demand that the US, the POWs made, which was, and this was not discussed in terms of the media coverage, but the single most important demand that the POWs made after kidnapping Dodd was the cessation of this very US military repatriation screening interrogation room. The POWs were claiming that the US was forcing subjects of North Korea, the DPRK, to renounce the state's sovereign claim over them. So let's return to Compound 76. So for the 3 days that Dodd was in the POW compound, he attended multiple meetings with the POWs. The POWs had collectively formed the Korean People's Army and Chinese Volunteer POW Representatives Association. And Dodd signed papers recognizing this representative organization. This act of writing by Dodd was central to the project of the POWs. This is where the POWs' demand for 1,000 sheets of paper is highly significant. Their demand for paper was to create a bureaucracy that would approach the POW as a subject of a legitimate state, not simply a wartime category. Using their position as POWs, these representatives in turn forced the international community to ask what type of political collective body the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, was, and to argue that it was indeed a legitimate state. The POWs were acutely aware of their position on the international stage, and now they were claiming the ability to govern the POWs themselves. And it was that very claim that became the transgression that the US military would call a mutiny. Compound 76 was not the site of a simple kidnapping. It was supposed to be the site of a diplomatic negotiation. So, once the POWs brought Dodd into their compound tent, it was clear that the kidnapping had been carefully planned in advance. In the evening, Dodd went to a theatrical performance as an official guest. The POWs even had special meals delivered through the barbed wire fence for Dodd's very sensitive, ulcerated stomach. And they even arranged to have a doctor give him a physical examination to make sure that he had not been injured. And this is An Jong-un, a POW who served as the compound doctor. He was not one of the members of the POW representative organization. Every time I see this, I feel kind of bad for him. He sort of looks like a little, oh my gosh, little deer in headlights kind of thing. Anyway, so he gives a remarkable testimony in his interrogation. So the US military asks him, what knowledge do you have concerning the seizure of General Dodd? He says, well, I got a request to go to the tent to treat General Dodd. En route to the tent, I meet the head of this POW representative organization, and he asked what I was doing. When I explained that I was going to treat the general, he stated, that's fine, go ahead, and please read along with me here. Upon arrival at the tent, General Dodd was taking a bath in a metal tub made from an oil drum. About 3 POW monitors were washing the general's body. When the general had finished bathing, I examined his fingers and knees and observed they were healing. The interpreter told me the general had a cough when he woke that morning, so I listened to his heartbeat and examined his chest. He appeared to be in good condition. In leaving, the general gave me a pack of cigarettes. The spectacle of Dodd being bathed by 3 POWs, and then the careful medical attention Dodd received, toes the line between the assertion of a complete surveillance over his body, but also the offer of special guests to an elite, special services to an elite guest, Dodd was unmistakably a prisoner under the care of his captors, who were POWs themselves. Yet there is no reversal of a binary hierarchy of power between a POW camp commander and the POW. Instead, the POWs carefully mark both Dodd's body and the space of the compound itself to establish and actually reassert Dodd's authority, which they explicitly made contingent on their own authority as a collective of representatives for the POW camp. So when Dodd walks out of Compound 76 3 days after the initial kidnapping, he told the same story to both the US military interrogation teams and to the broader public. The POWs treated him with the utmost respect, and Dodd himself noted, quote, "The only thing broken was my fountain pen." The US military would go on to investigate the Dud kidnapping, and here they faced the challenge to demonstrate that the kidnapping was a criminal act, not a political one. In fact, the narrative of the investigation board conveys almost a frustration with the fact that there wasn't an incident of violence to pin on the POWs themselves. Quote, "When Dodd was released, he was in good physical condition, and there is no doubt that his captors treated him well. Well, in fact, to the point of being patronizing." More than any show of violence demonstrated by the POWs, it was precisely this kind of patronizing treatment of Dodd by the POWs that had so threatened the US military, that the Korean POWs themselves had essentially asserted a political collective identity, a threat so large that 34 POWs and 1 US soldier died during the punishment for this mutiny. Now, what's interesting is that during the war, the US military was frustrated that American POWs had not committed a mutiny of their own in the Chinese and North Korean camps during the war. The US proposal for voluntary repatriation later became an unexpected double-edged sword for the United States. The US had essentially turned a historically vulnerable figure of laws of war, the prisoner of war, into a political subject of the international community, one who could make a political choice and was covered under the aegis of the United Nations. Well, quite simply, what would happen if an American POW chose or expressed their free will or desire to not repatriate to the United States? How would the US military, government, and public understand this choice? So these questions came to a head after the ceasefire was signed at Panmunjom in July of 1953. The breakthrough in the impasse around the POW repatriation issue was brokered by India, actually, whose delegates successfully proposed introducing a third choice to the POWs after the ceasefire, the choice of a neutral nation, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A. Aside from the US military and government being very discontent with India's role, which was essentially kind of a precursor to non-alignment politics that we will see later in the 1960s, the worst nightmare scenario regarding the POW repatriation proposal for the United States began playing out after the ceasefire. 21 American POWs chose to stay in China. And this is the moment, this is the flashpoint origin of when brainwashing becomes a widespread cultural obsession in the United States. The American public and US military accused the Chinese interrogators of having brainwashed the vast majority of the American POWs. And according to this logic, these 21 American POWs were painted as men who had essentially not made a choice, right? And were instead victims of an Oriental communist regime. In my book, I argue that this American fascination with and fixation on Oriental brainwashing was a phenomenon more immediately tied to American anxieties about the decolonizing world, here specifically the case of both Korea's and the United States in relation to decolonization, than simply being a manifestation of domestic MacArthyistic hysteria. Okay, so now I would like to tell you about the North Korean interrogation room. So one thing that eventually, it took 9 years for this FOIA to go through, but once it did, what I had access to was over 1,000 interrogation case files that were done by US military counterintelligence corps members of returning US American POWs from Chinese and North Korean POW camps, and they were interrogating them about their experiences of interrogation. So it's a little bit of a room full of mirrors. But after going through over 1,000 of them, I began to see a pattern. One really interesting pattern was that the Chinese interrogators initially were much more interested in tactical information. Makes a lot of sense, right? Because the Chinese are the ones who have lots of boots on the ground on the peninsula. The North Koreans had a different tact. In interrogation sessions with American POWs, the very last question the North Korean interrogator would ask the American POW usually was, "What are your hopes and desires?" It was the North Koreans who wanted to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson with soldiers. They wanted to listen to jazz records, which they did actually have on hand, with African-American POWs. Internationalism, it seems, was a key part of the North Korean interrogators' approach. So, in essence, what ends up happening in the North Korean interrogation room is that the North Korean interrogator turns the question about decolonization back around towards the United States. In other words, how did one decolonize an American? Just as the US claimed to know the will of the Korean POW and afforded them a liberal space of choice within the interrogation room, the North Korean interrogators also operated along the lines of desire and encouraged the American POWs to consider both themselves and the North Korean interrogator as occupying a similar position vis-a-vis empire and white supremacy. In the portraits that I read about these Oriental interrogators, what comes to the fore was a stunning pattern. The Chinese and North Korean military interrogators spoke fluent English. Sometimes the North Korean interrogators sang songs with the POWs, like Home Sweet Home, Home on the Range, My Old Kentucky Home, and You Are My Sunshine. Some of them had studied in universities and college in the US. And in fact, with certain POWs, they would encourage them to go to certain universities in the United States, for example, like the University of New Mexico, which kept on appearing in these files, to study political science in order to learn more about the US. And here we have the books that were available in the library of the POW camp. It's quite remarkable. It's actually really interesting. I mean, I grew up reading Black Beauty and O. Henry short stories. So this is what is available in the library. I mentioned that the North Korean interrogators had themselves gone to universities and colleges in the United States. They had gone to Detroit, to Philadelphia, to Los Angeles. They could actually very confidently talk about class and race relations in the US. Now, there is a final report. So all of those reports that I had just mentioned, those case files, those were all done and then assessed by a team of military intelligence and actually an American military psychologist to kind of assess what had happened in these POW camps to American POWs. Now, in the final report, there is no mention of those books that I had just shown you that were present in those POW camps. Instead, what the US military officials become very concerned about is that somehow the interrogation in these Oriental interrogation rooms are not seeming as Oriental as they would have assumed. So, while it is true that some physical measures were employed, these consisted chiefly of isolation in a small space, maintenance of uncomfortable positions, a few sharp blows, relatively mild beatings, face slapping, denial of latrine privileges, reduced rations, etc., falling far short of the fingernail pulling, elaborate castration, and other Chinese tortures popularly associated with Oriental captivity, which is a problem, because if there actually wasn't physical violence, then what could account for these American POWs deciding to stay in China? So this is where brainwashing comes in. So this is when the American military psychologists and military intelligence officials decide that what had happened was mass Oriental brainwashing. What's interesting is that there was one group that they juxtaposed with the vast majority of American POWs who had been supposedly brainwashed. There was one group, according to them, that was a model group of American soldiers. And this was the KKK. So, in these POW camps, what was also formed by the POWs were different white supremacist groups. They were called Golden Circle, which I think many of us know is another term for the Ku Klux Klan. And let's read together of what this final report said about the Ku Klux Klan members. This organization was formed in most of the camps, and the membership included a few well-meaning individuals who sent anonymous notes bearing the signature KKK to some of the better-known progressives, warning them to desist from collaborating with the enemy. Beatings were also administered to progressives and informers. So, when we step inside the interrogation rooms of the Korean War in the mid-20th century, we can see a war that is absent from the annals of Cold War history. My hope is that my work provides an opening for critical historical analysis for the kind of American warfare that has been shaping global politics in the second millennium. In a post-9/11, post-Cold War, post-Vietnam moment, where drone surveillance and extraordinary rendition serve as pliant front lines in a shadow war with terror. The divided Korean peninsula, with its hyper-militarized, demilitarized zone tracing the 38th parallel, throws into high relief the untenable logic undergirding this kind of Cold War triumphalist narrative. The Korean War, which officially broke out in 1950, has still not ended and is entering beyond its 70th year of conflict. A reconsideration of an intimate space of warfare, the interrogation room, provides us with the opportunity to read the usual Cold War stories of the Korean War against the grain, revealing how the terrain of human interior worlds had always been the grounds of US war making. Thank you very much.
All right, as we usually do, we'd love to take a few minutes where you're able to ask some questions. Elizabeth and Heather will both have microphones, and if y'all could just, if you see someone and you want to point them out, Dr. Kim can take those questions. We'd love to, if you would just wait until the mic gets to you, then we can all hear you well. So looks like one's going here to the middle. We can start there.
You mentioned that there were 30-some Chinese and Korean soldiers or POWs killed and one American. What was the occasion for that? I thought you said that the general had walked out 3 days later.
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. Yes, so after the general had walked out, the US military decided to send in tanks, paratroopers, and they also used tear gas and also concussion grenades. And in the midst of that melee, basically, that's how you had the death of 34 POWs and also one US soldier. Yes.
What did you think of the movie The Manchurian Candidate?
Oh, well, that's a great, such an interesting movie, right? Very complex, not as straightforward as one would think. For me, that was, I feel like that movie encapsulated like every single Cold War anxiety, right? It's like Cold War anxiety about Angela Lansbury being this domineering mother, right? And somehow that having an effect, right? There's a Cold War anxiety about China, right? North Korea, you have the houseboy, right? So there's a way in which the Manchurian Candidate is a really good allegory for all of the things that we see beginning here. Yeah. No.
Thank you. Would you be able to go into a little bit more detail about the role of India and the Panmunjom peace talks, and if other neutrals also participated in that?
Yeah, so what ended up happening was that, so I think another story that often gets lost in kind of mid-20th century, early Cold War history is that, it wasn't as if the US had immediate, power and dominance and hegemony over the United Nations, right? Actually, India had a lot of moral authority by the time you get to 1950 because of what has happened in terms of Indian independence and with Gandhi, right, and Nehru. So what Nehru actually says to the general who's going to be proposing this idea of a third choice or a neutral nation, he's saying that, okay, by proposing a neutral nation, right, we are going to be providing a different framework from a kind of a US-Soviet Cold War superpower play, right? US is not thrilled about this. But what's really interesting is that the kind of interrogation room, so they also say that their interrogation room, which they've set up at the 30th parallel, this is really the space where Korean POWs are going to be able to say what they want, right? But I found it very interesting in terms of choosing a neutral nation and the way they set this up. So for example, you can see here, what you would have is supervising members of the neutral nations repatriation committee. You had Switzerland, Norway, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Pretty interesting, right? So you have that. You have the POW who would sit on this bench. And then you had what they called explainers. So explainers, so for example, you are a POW who came from south of the 30th parallel, okay? And you're wanting to go north. What you would then have are South Korean military officials explain to you why you should not make that choice, right? What's stunning is that in one memoir, actually the memoir of General Tamaya, he recalls seeing this moment where the young man POW, who's South Korean, recognizes the South Korean military official. And they were both childhood friends from the same village. And the explainer, so when he comes into the room, he sees who this is. And the POW is like, asks the committee, please, I know this man. Can I sit next to him rather than on the bench? So he comes and sits next to him. The explainer says, I have something for you from your mother, just in case if I actually met you. I mean, I'm already getting verklempt. So he reads a letter that was probably dictated by the mother. I don't think, they're from such a rural village, I don't think that she was necessarily literate. And it's a letter where she pleads with her son to come home. And he breaks down. And he says, I will come home once Korea is liberated. So again, there's this, like, it's so hard for us to imagine perhaps now, but it really was a moment when Koreans did not believe that 30th parallel was going to be permanent, right? And so there are all sorts of things like that. So it really, I think for me, doing this research, what was so compelling was truly how intimate these kinds of encounters were, right? And so, but India, yeah, I mean, it's like a early non-alignment kind of policy, right? That's being inserted into the Korean War. So they were very effective negotiators, actually, especially with China, which makes sense, right? And the US. Sorry, I can't help these anecdotes, it's just like, it's like I want to share it, anyways, yes.
So in your talk tonight, you mentioned Truman.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, do you mention Chairman Kim, the present North Korean leader's grandfather,
Uh-huh.
or Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, maybe Zhou Enlai. And I'm thinking, because I know Russia supplied MiGs.
Sure, sure, yeah.
Stalin, are they mentioned in your book?
Yes, they are mentioned. However, this is when one has a very human limit, right? I don't have access to the kinds of archives I would want, right? I don't have necessarily the language, right, for that either. I cannot, I mean, I would love to be able to do archival research.
You can ask the Japanese to.
But there is a wonderful historian, David Cheng, who wrote a book on the Chinese POWs in this story. So really has much more access to the archives in terms of the Chinese state. Yeah.
What happened to the 21 Americans that stayed? Do we know?
Yes. So with the 21 Americans, I think it might be easier. Sorry. It might be easier to tell you maybe like the story of, so this is Clarence Adams. Clarence Adams is from Memphis, Tennessee. And it was broadcast after the signing of the ceasefire, they had these interviews with the 21, asking, and they had to state like why they were going to China, right? So Clarence Adams says, as long as there is McCarthyism and Jim Crow in the United States, I'm not going to the United States. So he goes to China. And he says that going to China, he could at least get a college education because he was going to be denied that in the US. So he goes, he gets a college education, he actually becomes a chef. And he becomes a very prominent chef for the Chinese government. And he's the chef for like all these diplomatic, visits, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this wonderful documentary called They Chose China. And they have some clips of an interview with him. And he says, with the Chinese, you've got to listen carefully because you'll go from comrade to then Mr. And when I became Mr., I knew that that was my time to leave, right? He knew that it was turning anti-American, right, in terms of China. So he does leave China for the United States. At this point, he has a Chinese wife and two children. They land in San Francisco. FBI meets them. And the FBI will continue to follow him for the rest of his life. In fact, he would joke about how he would say hello to them in the middle of a phone conversation, right? Because he knew that they were tapping his phone. So they eventually actually do go back to Memphis, Tennessee. And that's when Clarence Adams sets up the very first Chinese chop suey restaurant. And it becomes pretty successful. And I can't remember exactly how many in the end there were, but there were definitely more than two. And his daughter is a very prominent kind of community organizer in the African-American community in Memphis, Tennessee to this day. So many of them did come back to the US. What's also, I don't know if Brian Farah, is Brian Farah? Oh, okay, sorry. There's somebody in the program who had done an MA thesis on the American POWs of the Korean War. Brett. Sorry. I had just called you Brian. Okay, Brett. Well, Brett knows this very well because Brett has written an MA thesis on this, right, in terms of the American POWs, right? So I think you had looked at the Valley Forge. Was it the Valley Forge record? I'm sorry. I'm trying to remember. Oh, okay. Okay, that's okay. Maybe you can help me out with answering this question. But, one thing that I found so remarkable about the 21 who stayed is that if you look at their background, even though they were all considered to be low IQ, et cetera, they were from poor, like some of them were from like white sharecropper families, right? They were from poor families who worked on oil refineries, right? And there were others who were from the north who were from factory families, right? These young men, they were children during the Great Depression, right? And so they were bringing that kind of experience, right, into the Korean War. And I think this is why the talk about class, this talk about a kind of distrust about big business in America, right? I think that's why it resonated. Again, many of them did come back to the US, and it was extremely difficult for them. But they did try to, and yeah, Brett, I'm sorry, do you want to say a few words actually about the American POWs?
Yeah, so I know many of them, there was a very lot of cultural interest in, or he was trying to explain why they would choose China over the United States.
Right.
Like you said, many of them, it was because they were, so it was because they were dumb, they were impoverished, and in some ways they were also, if you've ever heard the term momism, that it was too much mom, that they were effeminate and not masculine.
Manchurian candidate.
And so, and really it kind of took on a life of its own. It was kind of a re-examination of American society at that point, of how American society, the churches, schools, and families are raising children to fight the Cold War.
Right. So these, 21 young men become a lightning rod for every single possible social anxiety, right, that American society is going through in the early Cold War, right? But again, I think it's, I'm forgetting, do you remember, Brett, which one of them had that interview? Oh, it's okay, sorry guys, sorry. Anyways, if you were to look them up, or if you want to watch that documentary, They Chose China, when they talk about why they chose China, they're so eloquent, and they're just saying, you know what, it's because, well, essentially because of their own background, and in terms of what they understood, that their opportunities would be in the US versus China. So it really becomes, it could have become a moment where there's a real conversation about class in the United States, but the brainwashing kind of story got put on top of that. Because who wants to talk about, Great Depression and class?
All right, well, I think with time, I want to go ahead and close this, but I do want to encourage you, if you would like to stay for a few minutes, Dr. Kim will be up here. If you have a book you'd like her to sign, please come and line up, and if you want to have a little more conversation, we welcome that. But for now, I just want to call our evening to a close. Please join me in thanking Dr. Kim for time.
Thank you very much.